A case to be heard by the U.S. Supreme Court involves two core questions about Arizona's 2022 voting laws and whether they conflict with the National Voter Registration Act. Now, although the case arises from litigation over Arizona election practices, its significance expands far beyond one single state. To talk more about this case, let's connect with Landmark Legal Foundation's Michael O'Neill. Michael, thanks for taking time with us here on The States. So what exactly is at stake in this case?
Yeah, good to be with you, Greg. What's at issue here is whether states can take reasonable measures to restore integrity into their voting process. Arizona here is taking measures to ensure that non-citizens are kept off the voting rolls by obligating individuals who fill out the state's voter registration form to show documented proof of citizenship, and also obligate state election officials to identify and remove non-citizens who are on Arizona's voting rolls. Again, this is a problem that's national in scope, and the federal government has largely failed to do this. You think about the Save America Act, which has similar provisions, which is yet to get through Congress despite significant public support. You have states like Arizona stepping into the breach, trying to address and solve this problem. The question here is whether provisions of the federal law, the NVRA, ban or preempt the provisions in the state law. Now, it's important to keep in mind that states have primary authority in how to conduct the time, place, and manner of their elections. The question here is the extent to which the states have this independent authority, separate and apart from the federal authority, to ensure that their basic common sense protections on their voter systems.
So you have the state wanting to implement these things to kind of weed out the possibility of non-citizens getting on the voter rolls.
Right. But
somebody sued to stop that. Tell us about the litigants in this case.
Yeah, certainly. The litigants, it's LULAC. It's an interest group that advocates on behalf of course, generally to characterize this, any kind of common sense measure that's put in place to, again, ensure the integrity of the voting process, voter identification, again, obligating the identification and removal of non-citizens from voting rolls, documented proof of citizenship. Any of these measures are met with immediate challenges in courts. And of course, they're filed in district court, circuit court, and then in this case has migrated all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. What makes this important here is the extent to which this federal piece of legislation, which is the NVRA, kind of encumbers states or prevents states from taking these sorts of actions. Again, the NVRA doesn't directly address the issue of non-citizens on the voting registration rolls. The NVRA applies to individuals who have died or have moved out of states. The question here is whether states can add additional measures, protections to identify and remove non-citizens. Remember what we're talking about here. The Save America Act would do something very similar from a national perspective, but we have what's going on in Arizona law that was passed several years ago that has been challenged, that's largely trying to fill in that breach.
Michael, from my understanding, it's illegal for non-citizens to vote.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's a fantastic point here. And I think a point that kind of gets lost in the discussion here is the protective measures that this has taken. States like California, for example, that mail every single person whose name appears on their voter rolls, whether they're ineligible, whether they've moved out of the state, whether they've died, whether they're not a citizen or not. If your name's on the voter rolls, you get a mail ballot in California. Well, what happens if you obtain a mail ballot, you're not eligible to vote because you might not be a citizen, and yet you might have mistakenly received this ballot because of lack of protections to ensure you're not on those voter rolls. You execute that vote, you've just committed a crime. So I think what's kind of lost in the mix here is these measures are largely protective to ensure that people who might not be eligible to vote aren't accidentally casting votes. It protects the integrity of the process. It ensures that legitimate votes aren't diluted, and also protects individuals who are ineligible from voting from accidentally voting. Something that might be a little speculative, but I think is a real probability and possibility here.
So again, what we have is Arizona officials looking to ensure that non-citizens don't get on the voter rolls and don't get ballots to vote in elections. They put laws in place to do that. An organization came in and sued. What was their claim there? That it made it less likely people would register to vote? Or what was the argument against ensuring we don't have non-citizens on voter rolls?
A couple things. Number one, they argued that there was a consent decree that was entered into years and years ago between a then governor of Arizona and a then Secretary of State of Arizona and a county registrar. And the consent decree banned, this is agreement entered into with an interest group, which is basically a sue and settle kind of case here. And
it's like a court oversight type of agreement that the court checks in on regularly to make sure that they're moving forward with the agreement.
Exactly. And the consent decree prevents the state from doing what this legislation promotes doing. And so the question here is whether the consent decree can trump a piece of legislation that the Arizona legislature enacts. Does a consent decree have precedence over a state law? Clearly not. So that's one issue. The next issue is the NVRA, which you mentioned before. There's a provision with the NVRA which says that you can't remove a registrant from a voter roll within 90 days of an election here. And the question here becomes whether a person who's ineligible to vote, a non-citizen, who is on a voter roll, whether that individual amounts to a registrant for purposes of the NVRA and its applicability.
Michael, so the Supreme Court, we're not sure when they're going to hear this. They have
they'll hear fairly early. The briefing is going to be concluded in fairly short order, so it's probably going to be argued. I think October, the first Monday of each October is when the Supreme Court term starts. I'm not sure off the top of my head when oral arguments are, but you can expect it in either October or November. Most likely, though, this is a high-profile case. You probably won't see a decision until March at the earliest, most likely June.
Yeah, and that's going to be June of 2027.
If you can believe that, yeah.
We may have to, talk with you around the time that ruling is expected to come out and get your reactions there. But obviously, it's an interesting case just out of Arizona. But as we said at the top, the outcome of this case could have ramifications across the country. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see that this is a national issue. The Census Bureau just announced, I think, that their estimate was 24,000 non-citizens had voted in the last election. We heard from New Jersey just a few weeks ago that they had 6,000 they acknowledged, and this is a blue state, acknowledged that 6,000 non-citizens were on their voter rolls. California has said in the past that there were non-citizens on their rolls that were accidentally placed via glitch. Virginia has done the same, Pennsylvania. So periodically you see this issue arise that non-citizens are on the voter rolls. It's not a speculative problem here. And those votes, to the extent that they're cast, they dilute the value of legitimately cast ballots. So I think everybody's thinking about election integrity. It's a paramount issue, despite the fact that Congress isn't doing anything, despite our best efforts on this. But it's something that's important to a lot of people, that their vote matters and their counts, and we have confidence in the electoral system. So it's imperative that the Supreme Court recognize that and largely affirm Arizona's efforts to protect the integrity of the vote.
Well, and to that federal legislation that has yet to advance out of the U.S. Senate, despite the House passing multiple different versions of it, how would that impact this?
Yeah, I think that would. We've discussed that. My take on that is it would moot it. Right? If there's a federal law that says that state election officials are obligated to identify and remove non-citizens from the voting rolls, at least to that particular issue, the documented proof of citizenship, I think that's also maybe a provision in the SAVE Act. You've seen iterations where that's in there as well. Again, when you're registering to vote, that you have to show a proof of citizenship. I think with those two issues, it would largely moot out the dispute here in Mi Familia Vota, because you'd have a federal law that would be placing the obligations on state election officials and to do exactly what Arizona is trying to do.
Michael O'Neill, Landmark Legal Foundation, greatly appreciate your time. We're going to have to talk with you about this further as we get closer to the decision, but also so many other cases. It is going to be a pretty busy Supreme Court term coming up starting in October, and we'll be tracking a lot of that here with the states. We'll be right back with more.